So, we're going to have chapter 10, the 1300s, also known as the Calamitous Century, from fear to hope. And everything that's on this PowerPoint slideshow, including the Black Death and everything, this is going to be what's covered on your last exam. And if we were in class, you would be getting the material probably the same exact day you're going to receive it on Blackboard, technology willing. So it should be up on 4:30 on Thursday at the, hopefully at the latest. Thirteen hundreds now, that's a wild time. There's a lot of things going on here. We've got three major things. We've got weather problems, we've got the famine combined with the pestilence, and then we've got problems with the church. So they're going to have bad times, but eventually it's going to start to look like it might get a little bit brighter toward the end of it because they're getting ready to head into the Renaissance period. We have something called the Little Ice Age, and that's referencing really some extra cold weather, particularly in Northern Europe, in France, and in some parts of the German, the Northern German states. But unexpected drops in temperature, as you know, can have an effect on your crops. So we have the Great Famine for, let's see, 13, 15, 16, and 17, 3 years of bad crops, low, food supply is going. It's called the Great Famine. It's going to lead to malnourishment and low immunity because if you don't eat right or you don't have enough food to eat, then that knocks your immunity down and you become susceptible to all kinds of things. Back then, there were many kinds of pestilences. Pestilences, of course, meaning diseases. And it's like when you eat, like say today, for example, you could survive on McDonald's, but you can still be malnourished. I mean, you can be really thin, you can be really overweight, you can be malnourished. It has to do with the nourishment that your body's taking in. So anyway, that does have an effect on your immune system, and your immunity being low opens you up to all these things. So what happens here is they're going to get all the usual suspects. There's going to be all of the versions of cholera and typhus and whatever's going around whenever. But the big one's going to come a little bit later when we talk about the Black Death. Talking about the church's troubles, well, you have a pope who is elected, and he takes the name Pope Celestine the Fifth, and he didn't really want to be pope, it was said, and it kind of comes, to be proven because one of the things he does when he gets in as pope is he issues a decree saying that a pope can quit. So he quit thinking that he could return to a simple life. He was a guy who loved to be with nature and just commune with God on his own terms. But again, he didn't really particularly want to be pope. So was he able to return to a simple life? Well, the short answer is no. What he had done, is he made it okay for the pope to retire. And I mean, he certainly didn't enjoy being pope. He only served a little over 5 months. And when he resigned, the problem was that the next pope who came in, who was Pope Boniface VIII, was afraid. He was afraid that Celestine V might be, well, because there were political things going on within the College of Cardinals. Pope Boniface VIII was afraid that one of the cardinals might get a faction together and they might put Celestine V in as an anti-pope. Okay, now anti-pope or anti-pope is a person who is actually opposing the sitting pope and trying to occupy the position of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the leader of the Catholic Church, and all kinds of stuff. So there's been several anti-popes, or anti-popes, I think is the real way to pronounce that. There's been several of those up through maybe the 1400s or so. But anyway, Pope Boniface VIII was afraid of that. And so he had poor Celestine, who was actually a hermit. He loved, as I say, loved to be in the woods and in nature. But he had poor Celestine V imprisoned in a castle, actually. And he had a couple of monks that were watching over him and, whatever. Now, again, Celestine is going to be a guy, again, he was a monk. He's going to found, though, the Celestine order. This is a new religious community, and it's going to be a branch of the Benedictine order after Saint Benedict. So anyway, that's what happened to poor Celestine. Now, as I said, the guy who became Pope next is Pope Boniface VIII. Now, Boniface VIII, again, he's put poor Celestine in prison, and in the year 1300, he formalizes what's called the Jubilee, the Jubilee year. Now, the Jubilee is something that was based on something from the Bible, Old Testament, but he's going to proclaim the year 1300 as a Jubilee year. And this is a special year where you get forgiven of your sins and you get a universal pardon. And again, it's mentioned in the Old Testament in the Bible. And it's supposed to occur, I think, every 50th year, every 50 years. And it's a big deal because according to the biblical Jubilee, slaves and prisoners would be free, debts would be forgiven, all kinds of things would go on. So he proclaimed that this Jubilee year, the year 1300. So what we know is that he's trying to get some power against the King of France. He's going to have this constant problem with Philip IV, also called Philip the Fair or Philip the Handsome. And Philip IV is going to try to exert his authority over the Pope. And so Boniface is trying to make sure that a lot of people, if they come to Rome, they're going to get a very special blessing if they come during that Jubilee year. So anyway, he had it set up where there was money to be made, and it would be something that he could use to further his own ideas as the Pope. So Boniface also, it's worth noting that Boniface VIII was one of the cardinals who had kind of suggested to poor Celestine, who really never wanted to be Pope, poor Celestine V. Pope Boniface VIII is the guy who one of the guys who actually encouraged Celestine to retire, to quit, and then he imprisoned him. So that's interesting, right? The dispute between Pope Boniface VIII and the King of France, Philip the Fair, Philip IV. Okay, this was brutal. This was really bad. In 1302, it was what caused Pope Boniface VIII to issue the papal bull called the Unum Sanctum. Okay, now, first of all, a papal bull is a document. It's something official that comes from the Pope. It's going to be some kind of a public thing that comes out, and it's something that's very important. I mean, a papal bull, there's been quite a few of those throughout history, but you could also just call it a decree. Okay, the Pope says this is, what it's the way it's supposed to be or whatever. But the papal bull is an official decree. It's an official letter, official document. And the reason it's called that is because it's usually sealed. And then in Latin, there's some way that you translate. I can't, my Latin right now, I'm like, you translate somehow the word seal to something that resembles the word bull. I think it's bulla or bulla or something like that. But anyway, that's where the name comes from. So he issues this papal bull. This is an official decree, and it says, in the Unum Sanctum, says there is only one church, And without that church, there is no salvation. Right? So this was issued in November of 1302. And what he's doing is he's putting down a lot of things that he believes will bring the Catholic Church closer together. He wants to make sure that it establishes also, or reestablishes really by this time, the primacy of the Pope as the head of the church, and then the fact that the submission to the Pope is something that has to happen if you're going to join the church and attain salvation. So he also then talks about, though, other things like there's the spiritual realm, and then there's the temporal or material realms. And the temporal leaders, the earthly leaders, because temporal, again, it's earthly, it's material, but it also implies, if you look at the Latin there, it also implies temporary, which means it will go away. So he says, okay, the spiritual world or realm, and then the temporal realms. The difference is, if you're on the material side of this realm, if you're the king, the emperor, it doesn't matter. You have to recognize the authority of the Pope, because the Pope is the spiritual leader. And that turns out that in a very Catholic France, if you may recall, it's very Catholic France up until the French Revolution, King Philip IV was not really all that impressed with the Unum Sanctum. And he gets in his mind that he's going to depose, which means remove, Pope Boniface VIII. I mean, there's a lot of background going on there with the Unum Sanctum. And one of the big things was, again, the Pope Boniface VIII and the French King, Philip IV, they've been feuding for a long time. And Philip had started taxing the church, all these kinds of things. But Boniface was trying, with the Unum Sanctum, of course, to make the power of the papacy transcend and be much, much, much more important, much larger, more all-encompassing than the king's power or the emperor's or whoever, right? So you're going to have Philip issuing his own document, Philip the King, against Boniface. Okay, and in that, I haven't read that in a long time, but I think I remember the way it goes. He basically called Pope Boniface VIII by his birth name and pretty much told him that he wasn't really a pope and so on and so forth, and accused him of all sorts of things, including even wild things like idolatry and magic and all sorts of. Anyway, there was another rumor that had gone around. Remember how I told you Boniface VIII had Celestine V locked away, so there was no chance of having an anti-pope. But there was a rumor that Boniface had actually killed, or had killed, had someone kill Celestine V. So anyway, when Philip actually has someone kind of write a rebuttal to Pope Boniface's Unum Sanctum, Boniface excommunicates King Philip. Well, King Philip, that's where he had made all of these wild claims, and Boniface, it was just, there was nothing he could do except say, no, I didn't do these things. I mean, what could he say? So he denied it. And then in 1303, sometime in late 1303, I believe it was, Philip's advisor named William de Nogaret is going to lead a band of some thugs over to go and attack the Pope. Okay, so they're going to attack the papal residence at Inagi, which is it's over in what we call the plains of Latium. You may remember it's close to Rome. I think it's east of Rome somewhere. But anyway, they went to his papal residence, and the Pope was attacked there, and he was roughed up. He was almost killed. Okay, a lot of the people who were in the palace left. Okay, there were only a few people that stayed to try to protect the Pope. Now, again, William de Nogaret was a friend of the king. he was told to go over there and rough up the Pope. Now, Nogaret actually prevents his thugs from killing the Pope. Okay, now keep in mind, that's, he could have killed the Pope. But what they did, and Nogaret is spelled Nogaret. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but I know that's how you spell it. Okay, guys? But anyway, William de Nogaret is going to actually tell them they can't kill the Pope. So what they did was they held him, kidnapped him, held him for 3 days with no food and no drink. So that was torture, right? So eventually what happens is finally, after all of that, you're going to have one of the cardinals that's going to come out with a bunch of people that he's rounded up to save the Pope. And Boniface was saved. He was taken back to Rome. And all this happened in September. Okay, all this had happened in September of 1303, I believe it was. And I know that he got really sick and died by October something. So I have a book that I really like to use when I talk about the 14th century, the Calamitous century, the 1300s. And it's a book that I mention this author quite a bit. I mention her also in 105, Barbara Tuchman. She's written all kinds of fantastic history books. She's one of the great women historians of all time. She wrote the book called The Guns of August, which was talking about the beginning of World War I. And she's also going to write a book that I love called A Distant Mirror, the Calamitous 14th Century. And that tells a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you is found in that book, written in Barbara Tuchman, Tuchman, written in her beautiful way of writing. But anyway, you're going to have a lot of mess that goes on after Boniface is dead. Okay, now have a slide right here that we're looking at. It says, we declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. Okay, and that's from the papal bull, the declaration, the decree called the Unum Sanctum. Okay, unum, anytime you see una, uni, uno, anything like that, it means one, right? And then sanctum, sanctification, salvation. Okay, so that's the Latin basis of those. So I mean, after Boniface dies, again, there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes on that's just kind of a disarray in, nobody really can tell what's going to happen next, because there's all sorts of problems that, again, I would call political within the cardinals, within what's called the College of Cardinals in the church, which one of the things they do is they pick the Pope, right? So anyway, there's going to be a little bit of time between the death of Boniface, and then finally you're going to have a little bit of time before they actually are going to have a pope that's going to be in for a while. There was one that was in there a very short time. He was only in there less than a year. And then the next one that was picked was going to be Pope Clement the Fifth. Okay, now he's going to move his papal residency to a place called Avignon. Okay, Avignon is going to be where the popes are going to reside from 1309, when Clement V moves them there, up until 1377, when Pope Gregory XI moves them back to Rome. So Avignon is a place that's under control of the French, and that's why Clement V moves there, is because Philip IV is, causing the church a lot of trouble. I mean, he's already taxing the church. He's already he's already had poor old Boniface pretty much killed, roughed up, and then, died soon after, and all the stuff we just talked about. So Clement V decides that he would rather just try to keep peace with the French king. Okay. So anyway, The Avignon papacy is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. And that's a reference again, that's a reference to an Old Testament time when the Jews were held captive by the Neo-Babylonians or the Chaldeans. Okay, it's an Old Testament reference. You don't have to know that. But if you ever hear it called the Babylonian captivity, it's, to many, it feels as if the papacy was being held prisoner by the French from 1309 to 1377. What happens over there is the Avignon popes become worldly, materialistic, and they're going to have, pretty much anything they want for that matter. And as they become more involved in the secular world, of course, they get less concerned with godly things, with the church, with the theology, and so on. Okay, so the Avignon papacy is known for its, giving the French kings a lot of power over them. And it's known for having, I believe there were seven actually Avignon popes, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I forgot about that. No, I think that's the main thing. But because we don't really have to talk about all the Avignon popes, but the most important thing is going to be when we do have in 1378 Pope Gregory the 11th. Now, he comes in and he decides that it's time to move the papal residence back to Rome. And that's a big deal, because if they've been over there under the control of the French kings for quite a while, then his choice to move the papacy back to Rome is going to be controversial. Okay, he's ending about almost 70 years of the Avignon papacy. So he's going to be the Pope from December of 1370 until 1378. So now the thing about Pope Gregory the 11th is he was actually a French Pope, as many of these were, if not all of those seven, at least I believe most of them were French, popes, because that's where they were. They were under control of the French king for a while. But you're going to see that Gregory the 11th is going to find that there's a lot of things going on out there, and he's got to ponder what is the right thing to do. And if you're really interested in knowing more about that, of course, you can read about all the terrible things that were happening during this period. But anyway, one of the influences when he was pondering what to do during all this time of where there's so many conflicts and just things are falling apart in so many different ways. Just for an example, he's going to excommunicate entire cities, entire areas, and it's going to be a mess. Anyway, we believe that he was very influenced by a woman named Catherine of Siena. She later becomes Saint Catherine of Siena. She's canonized by the church, and she was a woman who was a mystic, and she was a great writer. She has a beautiful work called, that they put together called the Dialogues of St. Catherine of Siena. She also, if anybody's interested, and you probably aren't, but she's also my patron saint, because I'm Catholic, but she's my favorite. And she's going to be very influential. Now, the thing about her also is that she is a female doctor of the church, which is nothing to sneeze at. Okay, she's up there with the likes of Saint Augustine and Saint Benedict and all those guys. Anyway, she had been talking about the papacy returning to Rome for a while. So Pope Gregory brings them back, the whole papacy back to Rome, and after he dies, it's going to be really hard, because you're going to have a group of cardinals that meet, and they elect a pope who's called Urban the Sixth. Okay, so Pope Urban the Sixth is not going to be a really, I don't know, he's not going to really be the best personality, I guess we could say, because he's going to make the French cardinals angry. So they decided to meet and they elected their own pope. Whew. How confusing is this, right? So you've got Pope Urban the Sixth, who was elected by the Roman cardinals, and then you've got the French cardinals over in Avignon electing a guy who became Clement the Seventh. So what? Okay, Clement the Seventh and his successors over in Avignon are referred to as anti-popes by the official Catholic Church. Now, this whole thing is called the Great Western Schism. This slide's just a couple pictures I grabbed from, I don't know, probably Google Images, just of the papal palace in Avignon. Look at the luxury of that place. I think I got ahead of myself a little bit earlier, because this looks like it's, a lot of what I said. But Urban the Sixth is elected, and then a lot of the cardinals elected him. They didn't really like, what who they had chosen, and they're going to end up moving to Anagni. I can't ever pronounce that. That's over by in the French regions, and they're going to elect Clement the Seventh as the anti-pope or the rival pope. So the second election is going to give what we call a schism, or it's going to cause this break, which is what a schism is in the church, and it's going to become even bigger than just the church. I mean, this is going to have repercussions throughout the countries in Europe and the leadership of Europe. So pretty much what happens is after Pope Gregory the 11th had moved the court back to to Rome, he's going to die soon after, and all that stuff that we talked about. But then what? Okay, because we've got to settle the fact that we've got an anti-pope over here. We've got Clement the Sixth, and we've got, it's just it's a big old mess at this particular point in time. And Urban the Sixth is going to be the pope that is going to be considered the legitimate pope, right? So anyway, the Great Western Schism is going to go on, where we have the split within the Catholic Church, which is why it's called the Western Schism. And it's going to go on from 1378 all the way up to 1417. You're going to have two men both saying that they are the real pope. And at one point, you're going to have three men saying they are the real pope. And again, it's all factions within the cardinals. It's all what we would call political to some degree. And it's not going to end until the Council of Constance, okay, in 1414, which actually the Council of Constance goes a couple of years. It goes on till I think 1417. Yeah, the Council of Constance is going to end in 1417. And this is when we have Pope Martin V, who's elected. And Pope Martin V is elected, which, he's elected because he's a guy that it seemed like everyone could agree on. It seemed like he was a guy that, I don't know if they thought he was more malleable, like they could control him a little bit more. I'm not sure if they thought, I'm not exactly sure entirely what they did think, but they believed that, both sides believed that he would be a good choice to become the next pope. And so, but what I do know is that they agreed, and they deposed the other two popes who are now, officially anti-popes. And the Great Western Schism was over. Now we're going to turn a little bit and do something different on here. We're going to talk about the Hundred Years' War, which actually was not 100 years, and it was not a war. It was a series of related armed conflicts, okay, or a series of wars between England and France. Now it's going to be fought from 1337 to 1453, which is 116 years, if my math is working and my brain is working. But it was fought mostly in France. Now, it's important for a lot of reasons. This is like, I personally think it's the most important medieval conflict. I think it's the absolute most important because of a lot of things that we're going to talk about. But some of the big ones, I mean, to me, the first big thing that shows exactly how important this conflict was is the fact that they're going to have the first standing armies since Rome. Remember, the Roman Empire in the West fell about 476. And now, look at us. We're close to 400 years here in 1337 when this war breaks out. They haven't had standing armies. Remember, feudalism, if you recall, you had the ability, if you were a vassal, to call guys who were under you. If you were a lord, you had vassals. If you were a vassal, you had lesser vassals. And anyway, the idea of a standing army for an empire or a nation is going to come back here again, as it had been in Rome. So to me, that's number one. And you're going to have some new weapons. I mean, we're going to have, gunpowder. So that's also a big deal right there. I can't say it's just one of the most. I personally think it's the most important one in all of medieval times. Don't get too caught up in some of these details. I'm going to tell you what's really important, but I have to also tell you the whole story here in order for you to get the big picture of what's going on. So we're going to have the events that caused this big war, or again, this series of wars. And one reason they call it the 100 Years' War is because it's a little bit easier than saying the 116-year series of armed conflicts between England and France. One reason they call it the 100 Years' War is because it's easier to say, but also because it's between the same two combatants, okay? It's as if it were one war, even though they keep signing, they'll keep calling truces and signing treaties and whatever for a while, and then they're back to fighting again. So it's much easier to just put it together and say, okay, this is the 100 Years' War. All right, and there's a lot to this war. We can barely touch the surface of it. But one of the things it started with was because of a dynastic crisis. Now we have, if you recall, we go back in France, we go back and we look at the Merovingians, which came about with Clovis, supposedly with his grandfather's name. Okay, that was the Merovingians. Remember, the Merovingians were overthrown by the Carolinians. Okay, and then the Carolinians are going to be gone by the late 10th century, the 900s, and we're going to have the Capetian dynasty, or the Capet, C-A-P-E-T, the Capetian dynasty. Now, the Capetian dynasty is going to make up the oldest continuous dynasty in medieval Europe. And so in 1314, Philip the Fair died. This is the guy, remember, that had the Pope roughed up, and he had him held captive for days and so on. And yeah, this is him. Well, anyway, Philip the Fair, Philip IV, King of France, dies in 1314. He leaves 3 sons. Okay. Now, his oldest son, of course, is first in line, and that's Louis, who will become Louis X. He takes the throne. And then Louis dies. Now, Louis doesn't have an heir for the throne, so it goes to his next brother, Philip. Philip becomes Philip V. Okay, so Louis was only in power a couple of years. Now, Philip V dies 1322, and Charles IV, his brother, became king. Now, this is important. because, and you'll see on slide number 14, I've got kind of well, it's called a genogram, I think. It's a family tree that I made up on something, I don't know, probably Microsoft Word, knowing me, because it was really easy to do several years ago. But it's a family tree, and you'll be able to look back and see where all these people fit if you're interested in that. But here's the big thing, okay? I've told you these names, and of course you need to know Philip the Fair, and you need to know the Capetian dynasty and all that, because that's where the trouble comes, right? The oldest continuous dynasty in medieval Europe. But, okay, you need to know that right here, this is the important turning point. When Philip V died, he had daughters. So when Philip V died, it didn't go, the throne did not go to his oldest daughter. It went to his brother. Okay, now if we were in, say, England, we have a queen right now in England. Okay, we would see that that throne would have gone to the oldest daughter, as it did, with many, as it did, go back, I don't know, go way back in English history. But I mean, England doesn't have a problem having queens. The French have a problem having queens, okay? The French don't like it. So they have set a precedent now that the next brother, the next male, took the throne instead of Philip V, the king who just died, instead of his daughters. Okay, so that's a turning point. Watch, pay attention to that. Watch that. Okay, so Charles, then he ultimately dies, of course, and he has no heirs to the throne. Charles does have a sister. She is the sister of, well, okay, she is the daughter of Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair's sons, remember, Louis X, and then next in line, Philip V, and then Philip died, and he had daughters, and so it went to his brother, Charles IV. Now we've run out of boys, okay? We've run out of male heirs from Philip IV. So Charles IV's sister, Isabella, has not a chance in the world of becoming Queen of England. I mean, we already set the male precedent, right? Also, she is married to King Edward II of England. He may have passed away by this time. I can't remember honestly, but she's married to the King of England, and her son becomes King Edward III of England. Now think about this, okay? And again, if you go back and you look at the next slide I'm going to give you, if you kind of take a screenshot of it or something, you figure out how all these people work together. It'll make it a little easier to remember. But this is really important, just like the male precedent that I mentioned before, because Isabella, of course, we know she can't be queen, as I said, but who's the next male in line for the throne? Well, if you're looking at it logically, it would be the nephew of King Charles IV. The next male, I mean, in that lineage, right? Well, yeah, but, okay, but here's the problem, okay? Edward III should have indeed, as the closest male relative, become King of France. However, the French did not want a foreigner in control of their government, okay? Because Edward III, I mean, is the King of England, right? His mother is French. She was the sister of, what, 3 kings and the daughter of 1 king of France. But no, 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 no. We don't want this foreign kid in here. So what can they do to prevent it? Well, they go all the way back to the time of Clovis, and they pull out this old Salic law. Okay, it goes back to the Salian Franks, and it says, oh, well, male rulers only. Well, yeah, okay. Well, Edward's a male. What do you mean male rulers only? You're not breaking any laws here. You're just trying to drum up something to keep Edward III of England from also becoming Edward, King of France. They do not want him to have both thrones. Here is the promised slide, slide number 14, where we have the family tree. So what's happened here is this, okay? You have Philip the Fair, there's his three sons, and then there's his daughter. You can see she's married to King Edward II, King of England, and then the son is Edward III, King of England. So what has happened is this, okay? We've gone all the way back and we're saying, okay, the throne of France can only pass through an unbroken male lineage. It cannot go from a king's daughter to her son. Now, all right, guys, come on. This is clear what they're doing. They're very clearly trying to keep Edward III specifically off the throne of France, right? So you have to go back up the family tree, which is why I made this particular family tree go all the way up. This is why I made this particular family tree go all the way up to Philip III. Okay, that's Philip the Fair's father and all those kings' grandfather, Isabella's grandfather, and all that. So climb up that family tree, and you see that Philip III had two sons, Philip IV, who became king, and Charles of Valois. Okay, Charles of Valois has a son named Philip Valois. Now that should say Philip the sixth. And I don't know if you can notice. If you look carefully, you can. Philip the sixth. I apparently didn't leave enough room in that box where it says Philip Valois became Philip the sixth, because I have the V up there, and then if you look really carefully, you see the I that makes him Philip the sixth is down there beside the years that he was in power. Okay, so how do they go back, climb up the family tree, and then go down that other branch of the family tree and find Philip Valois and make him king? Well, let's finish that story. As I said, in a blatant attempt to make sure that Edward III would not become king of both France and England, again, they're gonna claim this whole thing about the unbroken male lineage. Now, what they said was the King of France, the next one should be Philip of Valois, okay, Philip V. Now, there's an area called Gascony, if you can remember Gascony, okay, instead of Gwen, but Gascony is in the southwestern part of France, and this is a place that they disagreed on. Both countries said it was their possession. Well, clearly somebody's wrong. So they decide to come to this agreement. Edward III says, okay, cousin Philip Valois, you are more than welcome to become King of France. I won't fight you for it if you give the English our territory of Gascony. Philip Valois says, sure. And he becomes King Philip VI of France. Okay? Now keep in mind, they made a deal. Philip has given Edward Gascony in order to become king of France. Slide number 16. Well, we've already seen Edward III accepting his cousin Philip as King Philip VI, King of France. No big deal. Edward III still got England. England goes to war with Scotland, and while England is preoccupied there with Scotland, Philip sees an opportunity to get Gascony back again. So England is going to be able to win the war with Scotland, but France had sided with Scotland. And you know what? To top it all off, the French take back Gascony. What is up with this, right? Okay, that was the whole idea. Edward was going to accept Philip VI as the King of France if the English got Gascony. Now the French took it back. And then Edward's just purely angry now. He says, look, man, I am the legal throne to the heir anyway. And at this point, they are going to declare war by the end of 1337. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. This is simply a picture, a map showing you where Gascony is located, the area there, bordering France. and parts of Spain and so on. Aquitaine is in there somewhere, and really, that's just to show you kind of the area that they're fighting over. And I was right. I think I said it was to the southwest of France. I hope I said southwest because that appears to be where it is. I'm going to tell you the story of John the Good, the of of France. And the whole story about John the Good is one of those that you might hear and you'd say, really? Yeah, it didn't happen. Well, it did. This is actually a true story, and it's really kind of wild because, well, let me just tell you what happened. All right. What happened was the the French and the English had been fighting for a while by the time we get to this incident with King John the Second. So anyway, John the Second was the son of, I guess, Philip the Sixth, yeah. And Philip the Sixth had been, he had lost some battles, and there was all sorts of signs that the French were going to lose this war. Now, John, when he came in, before he was king, he was not a very healthy young man, and he was more of a guy, he was probably more like me. He would much rather be reading than he was, or looking at art or listening to music than he would be, wanted to be outside, because I think he was more of a, seems to me from what I've read about him, he seems to be more of an indoor type guy. So anyway, John is going to grow up and he's going to become king, and you're going to have, several peace treaties and several times that the war stops, and it does stop for a while. I mean, it's going to stop in what, 1352 or so. They're going to take a little break from the war, and then it's going to start again in 1355. So we have in charge of the English army, we have Edward, known as Edward the Black Prince. Okay, this is the English army. And one time, I don't know, he wore black armor, to my understanding, from what I remember about him. They called him Edward the Black Prince. Okay, so he's English. And the English come into Normandy, which is, of course, the famous French territory. And John is going to lead an army, and they're going to attempt, this battle there against the Black Prince's soldiers. Now, the English are way outnumbered here in this particular battle, but the problem is John, well, this happens so often in history. John was so sure he was going to win that, you know what, even when the Black Prince asked if they could talk, if they could have a diplomatic conference or whatever and try to figure out how to solve this problem, then it didn't work. That's how sure John was that the French were going to win. So he said, no, we want you, the leader, the Black Prince, we want you to come over and surrender to us. Oh, okay. And that's not going to work. Okay, this is just not going to work. So the battle is going to be a disaster. Okay, a lot of the French forces are not going to give it their all. Some of them are going to run away from the battle. You've even got two of John II's sons that actually leave the battle. Now, the thing is, they left the battle, but their father didn't. Okay, the father, this was the Battle of Poitiers. The father, King John, got captured. Now, he had tried to make sure he would not be captured. He had a lot of his people around him and protecting him and all that. But it turns out that there's a guy who fought for England who used to be a French citizen. Okay, this guy, cannot remember his name, but he came over to King John and basically said, look, if you surrender to me, I'll take you to the prince. Basically, you'll be safe. Okay. Now, the story goes that John surrendered maybe by handing him his glove. I think that was probably what they did at that time. I think. But anyway, that night after King John surrendered, he was taken over to the Black Prince, and the Black Prince and he had dinner, and it's really just a wild story. Okay, they're treating John like royalty, and he was taken to what we still hear about sometimes today, the Tower of London. Okay, this is a old. I don't even know when the Tower of London was built, but this is an old castle that's close to the River Thames in London, and he was taken there, and he was held prisoner by the English for several years. Now, here's the thing, though. They didn't put him under lock and key. Okay, he was allowed to go where he wanted to, and he was treated as a king. He was buying clothes. He had a court band to play music for him. He was not suffering. Let's put it that way. Meanwhile, though, one of John's other sons, one of the ones who did not flee from the Battle of Poitiers, his son, I think this was Philip, okay? John's son Philip had also been captured at Poitiers, and he was in captivity with his father. Now, John is going to try to figure out a way to set up a peace treaty and whatever. And the problem is, it's going to require a payment from France, okay? It's going to require a payment from France. And so John knows that that's not going to be likely because France doesn't have a lot of money at that moment. Now, King John's other son, the one who's actually the heir to the throne, king or prince rather at the time, he was called the Dauphin, Dauphin, the Dauphin. If we were in class, I would write it on the board, and you're going to see it again on another slide here in a few minutes. But the Dauphin is the heir to the throne of France, okay? It's like the prince. So anyway, John's son, the Dauphin, I believe it was Charles, he had come back from the Battle of Poitiers, and he was kind of nervous about what was going to happen. Okay, I mean, his father was captured, one of his brothers was captured, and he's not really sure what's actually going on over there. So when they ask for a ransom for his father, he's not going to say yes, he's going to say no. I made a mistake and somehow stopped that story on the last slide and moved on to this next slide. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to finish the story of John the Good. So anyway, he was captured and all this kind of stuff and whatever, and whatever I just said. But John's going to end up having to sign a treaty that is going to give a lot of Western France to England and all kinds of things. And again, Charles' son is going to reject that treaty and so on. Now, what we end up with, though, is the Treaty of, I don't really know how to pronounce this, the Treaty of Bretagne, I'm not sure. Okay, anyway, what that's going to do is that's going to offer the release of King John II of France in return for 83 hostages and some more payments. So John had already been held captive in a way. Remember, he was still treated like a king by the English for about, what was that then, 4 years, I think? And he's going to be released after signing this treaty. So John's son, Louis, who had not been captured at Poitiers, was someone who was given as a hostage. Now, Louis went over there, gave himself up, became a hostage, and then turned out that, I mean, it was impossible to pay this amount of money. So Louis he thought it would happen in just a pretty short time. Louis, the son, who was over in England being held captive now, remember, 83 hostages for his father John. So he thought it would take a little while. No. He's been over there for a few years. And he decides that he's going to escape. And again, he's treated well too. I mean, they're not treating him horribly. I mean, he's a prince. So he walks out of there and he escapes. He goes back to France sometime, I think it's in 1363. Now, when King John had come back, I mean, King John was looking around trying to figure out what in the world he could do to help keep his country, because he knew that they owed so much money to England, right? They were supposed to pay all this money for his release. So anyway, you're going to find that his son had escaped, and when he found out about it, he was not happy. Okay? When he found out his son Louis had escaped and came back to France, John the Good, okay, voluntarily went back to captivity in England, turned himself in. And I mean, everybody tried to tell him he didn't have to do that, but he said, look, my son was there, and he was kind of like collateral, right? It was kind of like Louis was there as collateral until the ransom was paid, and the French could not afford to pay the ransom for King John. So the collateral escaped. Now the problem was that was something that shamed King John. Okay, that ruined the family honor and all of that. He said, look, this is a matter of chivalry, really. So, in other words, let me just give you a quick let me just give you a quick recap here. The English pretty much let the king of France go to France to see if he could figure out a way to pay for his own ransom. And that's really what happened if you think about it. Meanwhile, his son escaped, came over, and John was like, oh no, you were supposed to stay over there because you were part of the collateral till we can find a way to pay off the money for my ransom. Which, think about that for a minute. It's wild. But anyway, when poor John went back to captivity again, everybody told him not to. But he told his son that it was not something a gentleman would do. You don't escape. That ruins the family reputation. And so anyway, he went back over there, and it turned out that John was not going to live very long once he returned over there. Okay, he went over there in January of 1360 something, 64, 65. He went over there in January of 1360 something, and he became ill pretty quickly after that. I mean, he was gone. He had passed away by April of, I want to say it was 1364. Okay, so this was a wild story. So if anybody ever asks you, hey, was there a French king who was captured by the English and then he was kind of let go to raise his own ransom? Yeah, the answer to that is yeah. I mean, sort of. Yeah. Weird, huh? All right, so now on to what's on this next particular slide. This one is just, honestly, I'll be honest with you. Up at the top, it just says what follows is not 100 years of constant battle and truces along the way and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I know. This is all stuff that it's already set up there. But there's some important early battles, and the Battle of Poitiers is on here, but I wanted to pull out three, actually four, I guess, early battles. You don't have to really know these, okay? I'm just going to make an example of them. You don't need to know these for a test, even though you can watch this video while you're taking the test if you want to. But you're going to see that it went through 5 English kings and 5 French kings. But the important early battles I want to call your attention to show that the Battle of Sluys, for example, go back to 1340, the French fleet was almost destroyed in this naval battle. England had control of the English Channel. Okay, the Battle of Crécy in 46 and then the Battle of Calais in 47 gave England control again of a lot of the French territory. Battle of Poitiers. This is where you had the capture of King John the Good, and then all of that stuff I just told you by Edward the Black Prince, okay, son of Edward III, who was, involved in the very beginnings of this war. So you don't need to know those battles by, again, for a test specifically, you're not going to have to name any of those battles. However, again, what I want you to see is that in the early battles, the French are absolutely getting hammered by the English, and that's important. So we're going to have some peasant revolts. We have peasant revolts throughout history. Peasants generally, remember, are considered to be the farmers in general. And there's a problem out there in the countryside during this time called the jacquerie. Now, this is a peasant revolt in France, and it's caused by the people's feelings of deprivation, because the war is like literally walking through their farms and stealing from them and just all sorts of things. So a lot of this is going to be spurned on by the hatred of the local nobles, right? Because the peasants, the farmers are generally quite poor compared to the nobles, and they don't have a lot of power. So they go out and they start killing the nobles. Now, some people say that they were killing the nobles to remove some of their debts. In the days where you couldn't really keep track of debts the same way we do today. But anyway, they were defeated pretty quickly, and very soon after that, a lot of innocent peasants were slaughtered. Now, because the nobles were afraid that, hey, if the peasants tried to kill us and raped our wives and did all this horrible stuff, what's going to stop them from doing it again? So they slaughter a lot of the innocent peasants. So what's happening here is the jacquerie, the name. That's important because they're all going by an anonymous name. Now, if we were in class, I would say, okay, what would you call a guy? He's in the hospital, he's lost his memory, or you don't know who he is. What would you call him? Of course, somebody would say John Doe. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so Jacquerie, Jacques, okay, John, that's going to be kind of the same thing, a very common name. And so they all called themselves Jacques to be anonymous. Even women call themselves Jacques to be anonymous in this group. So, the Jacquerie, just need to know this was out there as a peasant revolt, and a lot of peasants were slaughtered in the end. So the next big battle we're going to talk about, because we can't, do every battle in every war, because there's simply never enough time in a history class like this, which covers so much material. But the Battle of Agincourt's the next big one that we're going to talk about briefly. So after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, it was won by the English, and this was under the King of Henry V. But the English control most of northern France. So it looks like England is going to conquer France pretty soon and do exactly what the war started over. Okay? We don't want an Englishman to take over France. We don't want that. Well, it looked like it was about to happen right here. So, somewhere a little bit later into history, pops Joan of Arc. Okay. Now, the Battle of Agincourt was in 1415. So she, we think, would have probably been about 3 then. So a lot of stuff goes on before she's able to come in and help rescue France. So Joan of Arc had said she had heard voices, and she had said basically that God had told her that she was the one to lead the French to victory. Okay, there's a lot of stories built up about Joan of Arc, and there's, did she actually lead the men into battle? I believe she said at one point that she never really, you know, led them in battle. She was just, I think, being led by the nobleman, and she never fought or killed anyone. But there's all sorts of stories about her. There's a really good movie, at least it was when I saw it, and my taste may have changed. But there's a really good movie called The Messenger, just The Messenger. It's about Joan of Arc. If you get a chance to watch it, it's actually, yeah, again, I liked it at the time I saw it, and that, of course, that was in the late '90s, maybe early 2000s. But this is a young girl who does something. Okay, whether she fights, whether she goes into battle carrying her banner, whether she leads, it doesn't really matter because she did something that she was able to help turn around what looked like a France that was going to be lost to England. What's happening is, again, the English are winning. They are just stomping the heck out of the French. And by 1428, the English are ready for war again. And so they lay siege to Orleans. Now, if you look at what a siege is, it's a kind of a blockade, or they put up some kind of something so you can't get out of the city and they're going to trap you in there and stuff. That's usually what a siege is. So the English are ready to just, be done with the French and take the city of Orleans. Now, Joan of Arc was able to get in to see the Dauphin. Okay, the Dauphin, remember, that's the heir to the throne of France, the prince. So Charles, who will become Charles the Seventh, he had not been crowned yet because at that time he was afraid that if they had a big ceremony where they, did a coronation, that it would get the English all stirred up and they would come and try to attack and all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, she has an audience with the Dauphin, Charles the Seventh. So she, again, as I said, she said she had heard voices from God that told her she should lead the French to victory. Now, what that did was that raised the morale of the French troops. And as I said, it doesn't matter what else she did. She gave them something really important. She gave them the hope, gave them the hope. So what happens is they are indeed, the French are going to be indeed victorious at Orleans. So, I mean, for a while, she's going to have this streak, right? I mean, the English retreated from Orleans, the French kept it, and then for a few weeks, she's going to lead the French into several victories over the English. And eventually, here, she is going to have got the French into such a position that Charles, the Dauphin, was actually able to have his coronation and become King of France, Charles the Seventh officially. Okay, and she was there. Now, again, it's did she always said she never killed anyone and all that stuff, but she was there to provide that morale, if nothing else. We know she did that. So it turns out, though, she was fighting, or, well, okay, that's not the right word if she's not out there killing people, I guess. She was supposedly leading the men, which, again, some say she didn't do, but she was definitely there, part of something, when the English are going to capture her, okay? Well, I mean, to be technical, there were some soldiers that had captured her, and I believe they sold her to the English, I think is how it happened. But anyway, they tried her for heresy. Heresy, of course, is going against the religion, okay? And they said that she was on trial, and they said she was a witch as well as a heretic. So, of course, the punishment for being a witch is being burned at the stake, which is probably one of the top, maybe two things that just would be, to me, just terrifying to just even think of. But she dies when she's just young, maybe 17, maybe 18, just a young girl. We're not really sure of her exact birth. But she became one of the French history, or one of the French heroines that goes down in French history. And then much later in the 1900s, she is going to become, like, I may have mentioned this, but she's going to become a Roman Catholic saint. She's going to be sainted by the church, or canonized by the church as, not a heretic, but a saint. Anyway, the burst of confidence that her presence had given the French, as I said, Charles became, the official Charles the Seventh, King of France. He's going to reorganize his army, and he's going to, reorganize the government, raising the army, getting more men, and lots of men are going to be trained much better than they were before. And things are just like there's this momentum going for the French at this moment. Now he's going to centralize government under his control. Okay, he's going to take control where he has much of the power. And here's where we have some weapons. Now, again, the Chinese had gunpowder well before the West had gunpowder. But it's during the 100 Years' War that gunpowder is going to come and make its real first appearance in the West during the 100 Years' War. So you're going to have the longbow. It was going to be used a little bit differently during this time. You have gunpowder. You're going to have firearms. Oh, goodness, right? The first guns, pistols, whatever. And then, of course, cannons. So the last battle of the war is the Battle of Castillon in 1453. And this battle is significant. Anytime you have a first battle or a last battle in history, or actually anytime you have a first or a last of anything in history, you probably need to pay attention to it because it's probably important. But the Battle of Castillon, 1453, was the first battle in European history where artillery decided it, and it was the last battle of the 100 Years' War. Now we're going to switch a little bit, and we're going to talk just for a second about what happened to the French monarchy after the war. So again, you have Charles VII consolidating, centralizing the power under himself. So that's going to strengthen the power of the monarchy. And a stronger monarchy is eventually going to lead to absolutism, which really kind of hits its stride in the 1600s, a little bit later. So who won the war? Well, the French are going to lose a lot of battles, but remember, battles are not the same. Some people use those synonymously in their papers and stuff, and I'm like, no, 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 okay? A battle is usually part of a larger war, right? So who won the war? The French lost a lot of battles, but we generally say they won the war because they kept their territory, because the English were going to take over, and they were not successful in taking France. France retained its sovereignty. One thing that's going on here in the 1300s is we have the rise of literature that's not about the church. Okay, we're going to still have a lot of stuff about the church, of course we are, but not everything is going to be about the church. So we have the rise of secular or worldly literature. So one guy I want to pull out here and show you is Petrarch. Okay, Petrarch, you may or may not have ever heard of Petrarch, but Petrarch is called the father of humanism, and he writes what they call a Petrarchan sonnet. If you're interested in sonnets, poems and so on, you can look that up. It's got, 14 lines, I think. I can't remember. It's been a while. But I know who he is, and I know that he writes, or that he wrote, tons of these sonnets. But I want you to know he's the father of humanism, okay, which is a way of viewing the world, of course, way of viewing the world that is much more secular. Humanism, not looking at the world through the religious lens, okay? So the Petrarchan sonnet, again, if I'm not mistaken, it's going to have 14 lines, something like that, and there's a little bit more to that. They're divided into parts and all kinds of stuff. When I was in school, I loved English. I loved language arts when I was a kid. Heck, I even loved grammar, you guys. But the whole thing about the poems, and it had to, like haikus even, I just can't relate to those things. So the Petrarchan sonnet, again, 14 lines, it's about all I can tell you about it. And then there's some other stuff you do in there. But it's not worldly, okay? He's writing about other things that are not just about God and about the Bible. He's writing about, in this case, love. He writes about this girl named Laura, who was supposedly his unrequited chaste love. Okay, and chaste love means that, of course, they never got together. They were never a couple. She died supposedly young, and they were never able to be together. But he longed for her, I guess, the rest of his life because he continued to write those poems about her. So, yeah, worldly literature, writing about emotions and love and all that stuff that has to do with humanity. And some more secular literature. You may have read some of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is a great collection of stories written back here in the Calamitous century. Most of them are in verse, poetry form. Two of them are in prose. Some of them he made up. Some of them are ancient tales. Now, it's told in a frame tale, which means that there's one major tale or one major story going on. And in this case, it's the story of Christian pilgrims going to Canterbury to go to St. Thomas of Becket's shrine. They were making a pilgrimage, right? So that's the big tale. Now, within a frame tale, there's a bunch of smaller tales that are told within that context. So, in other words, the big tale is you've got all these pilgrims headed out to a certain place, and it's not like today. They're not going to get in a car. They're not going to get on a, train. They're not going to whatever, however you're going to get there. I started to say plane, and I'm thinking, oh, surely today nobody's really getting on planes. At least maybe not right now for a while because, we're coming to the end, oh dear Lord, we hope, of this COVID-19 pandemic. But either way, they're going to be walking, or they're going to be on horseback, or they're going to be in some kind of a horse-drawn buggy or something, right? So what do they do when they're on their way somewhere? It takes a very long time to get there. Okay, they're walking or riding, whatever, but they're talking to each other, large groups of people. They're traveling in safety. So the Christian pilgrims who are on their way to this shrine are going to tell different stories. Now, each one of the stories is named for the character who told it, like the Knight's Tale or the Wife of Bath's Tale, or in the one I'm going to tell you, the Pardoner's Tale. Okay, so Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. It's a story that has a main frame within which all the other stories are told. Because as they're walking along, they tell each other stories to pass the time. Okay, so keep that in mind. So the story I like to tell is the Pardoner's Tale. This is, I don't know, this is one of the great ones. If you've never read the Canterbury Tales, it's better to read, to be perfectly honest, in a class. Like I say about a lot of the very very older stuff. It's a lot more interesting if you have someone there who understands it and you can talk about it with a bunch of different people. But Canterbury Tales, I never finished it, but I've read a lot of it. I've read enough of it. It's great literature. But this particular story, I picked this one because I like it. It's also it's not one that he created himself. This is an old, I believe, an old Asian tale, came from the Orient somewhere. All right, here's the story. So you've got these three guys, and they're on their way home from wherever. They're walking down the path, and they're so angry. They're crying, they're angry, they're just really upset. And that's because they had been attending a friend's funeral, and they're all pretty young. And so they were drunk, drinking it up, and they were talking how angry they were about their friend being, killed basically by whatever took him, whether it was a disease or whatever. They're so mad. And so one of them says, I think we should go kill death. Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so we're going to go kill death. And so they're like, yeah, we're going to kill death. And as they're walking down the path there, they happen to run into an older man. And one of them says to the older man, hey, old man, do you know where death is? I mean, we're looking for him, and we thought you might know because you're closer to him than we are. Ha ha, right? Okay, old man says, well, boys, I do know where death is. Death is under that tree over there. He points to this tree. And they're like, thanks, old dude. We're going to go kill death. And so they go over to the tree and they find that there's not death under there. There is a bag of gold. They are wildly rich beyond their wildest dreams. So they're trying to figure out how they're going to be able to take the money safely without getting ambushed and killed for their money. And it's a big old problem. We got to figure it out. So they're under the tree and they're thinking, and eventually they get hungry and thirsty, and so they can't all go into the town. There's a village over there. They can't all go into the village and carry the money, and it wouldn't be very easy to do. They're probably going to do it under cover of night. So look, man, we're hungry right now. One of us has got to go into the village, and they don't trust each other. Okay. Well, of course they don't. So they draw straws. Turns out the youngest guy gets the short straw, which means he has to go to the village. And he's going to get them some ale or wine or something and some cheese and something to eat and whatever. While he's gone, the two guys that are left under the tree, they start talking. They're like, man, if we killed this guy when he comes back, our buddy, we kill him, we can divide the gold up and we will be, just two instead of three. We will be so much more wealthy. And so they make the decision that as soon as he gets back, they're going to attack him and kill him. Meanwhile, he's in the village. He's bought wine or ale or whatever and some cheese and some stuff. And he's decided, similar thing. He's thinking, man, if I could only kill the two of them, I could have all the money. I could be really rich. So he poisoned the wine. Before he got back there, they've prepared what they're going to do. He's prepared, with the wine. So he gets back under the tree. They attack him. They kill him. And then they celebrate by drinking the wine. So if we were in class, I would say, what's the moral of that story? And you would probably say greed. And you would be right. Okay, so that's the end of this. I do have one more slide, basically just over the Black Plague, but I want this one to go ahead and go out so it can be uploading as quickly as possible because it takes forever. All right, watch for the Black Death, the Black Plague video to come up also ASAP.